make sure I have the time right. So, hello all. My name's Tim. You've probably seen my partner Bronwyn, our son Raziel, and my daughter Merwin, who's back with the preschoolers, roaming around and doing all those fun things that kids do. I'm here to talk about fatherhood, and I feel that I need to give a bit of a personal background because I've had an interesting relationship with fatherhood. Really, my mother was my role model and is a strong, independent woman and taught me of all the different things, be it cleaning, cooking, cars, construction, tools, healing, money management. Took me on adventures like scuba diving, whitewater rafting, spelunking, just to name a few. And she left my father when I was about 2. And then she moved in with her family and was kicked out there because of the person that she would later marry, who was 20 years older than her when she was already about 20 years old herself, and a black man. So they ended up getting married, and she ended up divorcing him when I was about 13 and didn't get married again until I was about 20 or so. So it's been an interesting relationship with fatherhood. I saw my dad about once a year for a long time, then every 2 weeks. He taught me little things here and there. My stepfather taught me quite a bit, and it was just one of those things of my mother was my constant. At 17, I did have a mentor that taught me a lot of different things as well, a father figure, and all three were different in many ways. So I find it hard to speak on fatherhood without also just speaking on being a good parent. According to Michael Lamb, who is a psychologist of the University of Cambridge and has been studying fatherhood since the 70s, the factors that lead to the format of relationships are exactly the same for mothers and fathers. It really comes down to emotional availability, recognizing the child's needs, responding to those, providing comfort and support to the child's needs. Fathers typically bond through play, but that's actually seems to be more due to division of labor and child rearing. One of the points we have learned is that there isn't an ideal model for a father. The different people do it in different ways. Do dads need to do it in a masculine way? No. They need to do it in a way that makes sense for them, that feels authentic, that allows them to be fully, coherently engaged with relationships with their child. And I tend to agree with Mr. Lamb. Being supportive, raising adults. Don't forget to give them psychosis that they can only attribute to you later in life. And above all, really, lead by example. And one of the things that I'd come across while doing research and thinking about it was someone asking, fathers, if your child was in a relationship with someone just like you, how does that make you feel? If you think on it and you don't really have good feelings, might need to change something. The biggest thing I would have to say is about fatherhood is breaking stereotypes. No boys will be boys. She's just a girl. Hits like a girl shouldn't be an insult. I plan on teaching my daughter to hit right. So different things like that. Be silly, dress up, play tea party, play with stuffed animals. Really be a child yourself. That helps them, but remember, you're raising an adult. So try to do that as well. It's okay to cry when you're hurt. It's okay to be down. It matters what you do afterwards. It's getting back up. So teaching as a role model is the biggest thing that I can say about fatherhood, and trying to break those negative stereotypes that seem to be out there, and just being the best you can and raising someone who is going to be better than you. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Sam. When I was asked to share a reflection about fatherhood for this morning's service, the first thing I thought of to talk to y'all about was my father. He and I had a strained and difficult and oftentimes painful relationship, and he died earlier this spring. And I've been going through the process of sorting out his things, both the physical, but also the more metaphysical unpacking of his life, and asking what it meant and why my relationship with him was full of so much pain for both of us. But despite his having had a gregarious and charming exterior, my father was a deeply private man. And while he was not a member of this congregation, and as far as I know, he never came to this church, he was part of the larger community, and several of you may know him or may know my mother. And for me to reflect on his life in such a public way about parts of himself that he kept so hidden would have been very painful for him. And ultimately, I decided that his story is not mine to tell. So the next thing I thought about talking to you about was my children and the relationships that I have with them. I thought about sharing some of the struggles that we've gone through and how I've dealt with those struggles, occasionally with grace and ease, but more often awkwardly, clumsily, just doing the best I can at the hardest job I've ever had. And as much as I'd love to shower you with stories of these three brilliant, emotional, and sensitive children and what it's like to be their dad, the thing is, my kids are also pretty private people. And none of them chose to stand up here and give you a reflection. And all three of them sometimes feel uncomfortable being the center of attention, and this community is theirs as much as it is mine, and how they share their lives with y'all needs to be their decision. So I decided their stories aren't mine to tell either. Then I thought I'd say some words about fatherhood generally and about what being a father means to me, and it struck me that much of what fatherhood means to me is connected to this notion of stories. Relationships are made up of stories. They're partly made of the stories we tell each other, the stories we tell when we say I love you or ask how we can help, the stories we tell when we say that we're too busy or when we lose our patience. They're also made of the stories we tell ourselves about one another. There's this great visual aid that I can't share it with you, but I want to talk to you about. It's a Venn diagram. I've seen this on the internet a couple of times with concentric circles. And the outermost circle is what I'm thinking. Down from there, a slightly smaller circle is what I can put into words. Slightly smaller than that is what I can say out loud. And the smallest one of all is what other people understand. That small circle is so much smaller than what I'm thinking. But the more you know someone, the better you know them, the bigger that smallest circle, the what people understand, can get relative to the whole, right? Because the more time we spend together, and especially as we go through hard things together, we learn to tell one another's stories with detail and nuance. And while I can never know my children's stories perfectly, what I want to do as a dad is learn the stories that my kids tell about themselves and help them to grow and shape those stories. For a kid, the story about where you've been, where you are, and where you're going is so much more flexible than it is than the stories that we tell as adults. And as a dad, I hope I can encourage my kids as their interests and passions develop and as they add new branches to the stories of their lives. When my kids dream, I want them to have a realistic assessment of what it will take to reach those dreams that leads them to the conclusion, I can do that. Being a dad to my kids, then, is about making the story as good and healthy as it can be. And this is hard, because the story of me and my dad was often very sad and full of a lot of hurt. And so many of the stories I read in books and see on television and in movies and in songs about fathers, these aren't the stories I want to tell about my relationship with my children. Stories about fathers and kids, and especially fathers and sons, are full of struggle. Our Western literature is full of these stories all the way back to Oedipus killing his father, or all the dysfunctional father-son relationships in the New Testament. In all that canonical history, there aren't very many stories about great, loving, caring dads. And this antiquated notion of a stoic and angry father is still a powerful part of our collective story. But what I want to say is that I'm hopeful that we are in a new moment. I'm hopeful that the kind of father I want to be with my kids is part of a generational movement, one that started with a few folks on the fringes of my grandparents' generation, continued into my parents, and is hopefully taking root and becoming more mainstream. This movement I'm talking about is one that's grown up alongside feminism, one that has resulted in changing tables in men's rooms, the trend of dads posting videos on social media teaching other dads to braid their daughters' hair, a movement of dads to find a place in society and ourselves where we can strike a healthy balance between those traditionally masculine virtues and other more traditionally feminine ones. A movement that calls on dads to be nurturing and compassionate and kind and responsible, while still being strong and ambitious and diligent, and even sometimes, when it's called for, stoic. That's the story I want to tell about myself as a father, and the one that I hope my children grow up telling about me. I know that I will make mistakes, but I hope that as adults, they will think back and be able to tell my story in front of a group of people like this, proud, and knowing that it's a story that I would want them to tell. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Patrick, and it's nice to be here in my community. It's been an interesting week for me. So much like Sam, I debated what I should talk about today because the topic of fatherhood is one that's fraught with many things. I thought about talking about being a father, and I have two terrific children that I'm very proud of. But I think that they would be pretty clear that I don't have any specific insights, wisdom that are worthy of sharing with the congregation today. I also thought about talking about my own father, who became estranged from me when he and my mother got divorced when I was about 12 years old, but I decided against that. It's a bit of a downer. So instead, I wanted to take the positive approach and flip that story on its head and talk about another kind of fatherhood, which I think is incredibly important in our society and continues to be so and probably will grow ever more important. And that is, I wanted to highlight and bring attention to those who join a family already in progress, so to speak. So we call them stepfathers in the vernacular, but I'd rather call them bonus fathers. And sometimes the bonus is not always so clear on either side of that relationship. This can be especially problematic when the father comes into a family already in progress with, say, slightly older children, say middle schoolers. So like in my case, there was a couple of fairly strong-minded children in middle school, one younger. That's a group that's not always known to face the world with acceptance and gentle grace when circumstances change. And so one always as a child feels like you have this particular weapon in your pocket. You're not my father, and you decide when you're going to unfurl that baby. And it takes a lot of strength and patience on the other person's part to know that that's coming, know what that means, how to deal with it, and how to find their own way in the family. And I think that that's a really special thing that people do. So my own bonus father was among the sweetest and nicest human beings I've ever known. He served in the Korean War and started his life trying to make it as a jazz musician. He moved from Ohio to LA. He played the trumpet. And in fact, during the war, he served in a jazz band that went around just a few miles from the front line performing for the troops to keep the spirits high. And he had a lot of great stories to tell about that. So things didn't work out as planned, as it probably a true story for most burgeoning jazz musicians, and he ended up being an inspector for insurance companies that would look at buildings to see whether or not they were a decent insurance risk. So that was maybe not exactly what he had in mind for his life, but instead, I mean, he did that job, and I think he actually enjoyed it, but he filled his life with friends and music, and mostly what I would characterize, or we maybe would describe today, as just chilling out. He was the most chill person I've ever known. And so for me, he came into my life at a perfect time. There was obviously upheaval, and he gave me two of my most cherished gifts. That is a love for music and a love for humor. I have written a sense of humor, but that's really an objective criteria that only you can judge. So he taught me how to play trumpet, and I never really got the hang of jazz the way that I would have loved to, and I was never really that great at trumpet. But it did provide me the most immediate means of meeting my wife, Kay, and so if he gave me nothing else, that was of incredible value. But more important than that, from my point of view, he had this childlike and slightly silly way of being in the world that was incredibly refreshing. And he brought humor to every single activity that he participated in. And I think the world would be a better place if we all approached things that way. So he always looked at the lighter side of life, and that's something that I've tried to engage in. And he and I were constantly joking around, and that was a great training ground for controlling my natural sarcastic tendencies to try to be one of more positive engagement. So I'm very grateful for that. So on this Father's Day, I do speak as a father, and how one brings those values and a sense of openness and patience to the world. But I also speak as a son, and I give my heartfelt thanks to all the bonus fathers out there who have taken the challenge of picking up on being a parent partway through a child's life already. All those of you in the room who have done that, you make this world and so many children's lives just much richer and better for it. So I thank them, I thank you, and I thank my own very much loved and dearly departed bonus father, Dave Kent. He was everything I needed when I needed it. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm John Wagner. Fatherhood's a big subject with a lot of elements. When I narrowed it down for this morning's 5 minutes, I thought about two things: love and legacy. Love and legacy. The love element begins with my father. He was a good father and a good provider, and he could be challenging and frustrating at times. But there was one thing about him that stood out for me as I got older and was able to have a perspective on him. That was his unconditional love for his family. There was never even 1 second in my entire life that I ever doubted his love for me. He could be cranky or demanding or distant or hold maddening social and political views, but I always knew he loved me. When he was entering hospice care at the end of his multi-year battle with cancer, he waited for me to show up at his bedside and have a short, gentle conversation with him before he succumbed to the painkillers and drifted out of contact with us. He waited to say, "I love you," one last time. I learned a lot about real love from him, and certainly from my mother too, who was much easier to get along with. But today is about fathers. I've certainly been compared to my dad, and some of the things that frustrated me about him are a part of me. I've managed to tone down some of those characteristics, but not all. I believe I've also managed to carry on many of the good things about him, and knowing how to love my wife and son unconditionally is one of them. Even when I am annoying or stubborn, occasionally, I'm sure they know how much I love them every day, all the time. This is surely the best thing a father can do, and I thank my dad for showing me its importance and how to do it. There's also the question I think we all experience of what we may be leaving behind us when we go, our legacy.
No fair having visual aids.
Yeah, that's unplanned but welcome. Yeah. A very few of us will write a great American novel or contribute to the search for the unified theory of everything or hit more home runs than anybody else. Most of us will be remembered as long as there are people who knew us. And when they fade, our existence too will fade into the long march of anonymous history. Maybe our 15 minutes of fame will get recorded in Wikipedia, and maybe not. This is not a terrible thing. It's merely the way of the world. Billions of us have and will follow this path, which is as it should be. Still, we sometimes stop to think about our impermanence in the grand scheme of things. I think most of us just want to know we've contributed something of value to the world during our time here. I've known for a long time that, given my tendencies toward self-indulgence and immediate gratification, I was not a good candidate for a big Wikipedia entry. But I have thought about what good things I will leave behind. There's a decent little list, but at the very top is my son David. Obviously, I had some help from his mother in both his creation and parenting, for which I am grateful, and as I'm sure he is. There are also the good genetic characteristics for which I can take no credit directly. Jane and I have always agreed that some of his best qualities were there from his first breath, and the best we could do was to recognize and nurture them along the way. We seem to have done okay with this. I think those of you who know David would agree with me that he can be unequivocally categorized as a good person, and a very good father too, as it comes to that. So when I look at what I have contributed to the world, I can say that my legacy as a father is by far the most important and valuable contribution I've made. It's not likely, but I may still write the great American novel. But even if I do, it will pale in importance compared to being a father.
Hi, I'm Steve Kuzma. So my experience of fatherhood in 4 to 5 minutes. 4 to 5 minutes? Really? I could write a brick of a book about my experience as a father. The chalice lighting, the call to service, the reading, and my predecessors here expressed many of the highs and low points that can be experienced as a father. What do I say? What of my experience? My children were born when I was 32 and 38 years old. My wife and I met when I was 28. We wanted children, it just took us a little while to court, marry, and settle into life enough to get pregnant. Brian was born after an overnight labor in the hospital. He came out blue and with so-so APGARs. APGARs were my introduction to parent bragging rights stats that we get on our children. I was in a pulled an all-nighter haze and running back and forth between the less than intensive care nursery and my wife. It was check on baby, report to wife, repeat for a while. But the funny thing was that felt right to do. I was engaged. This is what I needed to do. During that day, Brian improved, mother and child were reunited, and in a few days we were strapping him into a car seat and taking him home. He was colicky. None of us slept well for at least 9 months. I remember that in the middle of one of those nights, I was trying to comfort him, get him back to sleep, that I looked at what I was doing with some detachment and noted that everything I was doing felt right and good. My next thought was something like, that's amazing, we really are programmed for species survival. It was also in those early months that I looked at him and had a vision of him as an old man, that he would live a full life and grow old, and in that moment I felt connected to all of humanity throughout all time. That we have children and do our best raising them, and that my wish for him was that he could grow up, find something that he enjoyed doing for a career, and he would find joy and satisfaction and peace in his life. My daughter Laura was born about 6 years later. She slept, she was great. But still, I was 38, and during one 2 a.m. feeding, I thought to myself, I can't do this again. And 2 children was enough. I also remember realizing early on that I had taken on this father job for the rest of my life. But I really enjoyed it. I can honestly say that I enjoyed every age and phase of both of my children. And yes, there was worry, exasperation, homework, grades, and other rough spots, but overall, their behavior, their friends, their activities, it was just never a problem. I loved the games, the walks, the car rides, coaching kids' teams, the school plays, reading to them at bedtime, birthdays, holidays, family get-togethers, driver's eds, everything that we as parents do. And I'm still doing dad things for them. I'm grateful that they ask me what I think about something or ask me to help. But it was my grandson that brought me to Oregon. When Brendan was born 3.5 years ago, I experienced a wave of emotions and thoughts that went something like this. I really want to know him. I want him to know me. And that's not going to happen if I stay in Michigan. I need to move to Oregon. So it's super convenient that my daughter and her partner moved to Portland when my son and daughter-in-law moved here for school 6 years ago. All have stayed and put down roots. So I put the wheels in motion to close my business, retire, sell my house, and move to Eugene. And that's a lot easier to say than it is to do, but here I am, close to my children and grandchildren. Miles was born 7 months ago. And I met Anne here in the choir at UUCA 5 months after moving here, and that has made my life all the richer with her children and grandchildren to form a larger family for me. Along the way of this story's arc, from my son's birth to now, there has been joy, disappointment, fear, laughter, worry, stress, exasperation, excitement, sleeplessness, the death of their mother, work, celebration, the whole depth and breadth of the human experience. And I've had this adventure because I married and had children, became a father, and embraced fatherhood. But grandfather is a different job description. I am Papa, and I get to enjoy Brendan and Miles in a different way. I'm not responsible for everything in their lives. In my relationship with them, they still have the whole spectrum of child behavior, but I have more time and patience and experience with which to deal with it. And I always get to hand them back. I'm grateful for all this and find myself with this wish for my grandsons, that they grow up and find something that they enjoy for a career, and that they find joy and satisfaction and peace in their lives, and that I get to be a part of it. Thank you.